this morning will be continue our study in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 6. Let me give you a rundown of the first 5 chapters as briefly as I can. In chapter 1, Nehemiah gets word about Jerusalem and the destructive nature that it's in. In chapter 2, he seeks God for permission to go there. In chapter 3, God gives him the okay to go, and he goes to the king to request 2 things: protection on the way and the materials to rebuild the walls, and he gets both. In chapter 4, Nehemiah goes out at night and inspects the walls. In chapter 5, they rebuild the walls. You remember how long it took to rebuild the walls? If somebody don't answer, we're going back to chapter 1. Down. Perfect. That's kind of like the Price is Right game. Higher, lower. You got it. You were close first time. 52 days to rebuild the walls. And then the next couple of things that we have looked at was Nehemiah and the people dealing with outside distractions that were trying to prevent the walls from being built. And then last week we looked at something I think that was more destructive than outside influence. It was inside turmoil. The Jews were bickering back and forth, and I've told you on more than one occasion, it's it's the inside business that usually wreaks more havoc on our lives and in our churches. It's what we do to each other that does more destruction. They were building the walls to stop the enemy from the outside from attacking. They built the wall, and they realized they had a greater enemy, the enemy inside the wall that they were dealing with. And I share with you, I think, 2 things that stand out in this book from chapter 1 all the way through the end is the fact that God has a plan for all of us. No matter where you are, no matter where you've been, when God created you, He created you with a plan and purpose in mind. And that begins with a relationship with Jesus. That's the starting point. And then it's finding what God has gifted you to do. Every one of you may think, no, I don't have a gift. Yeah, you do. God's given it to you. God has gifted you to do something, and I think it's essential that we find it and do it. And a second truth in this book is that God does the impossible. I don't know how many of you are familiar with basketball or keep up with it at all, but Mississippi State's women beating UConn is almost as big a miracle as Nehemiah getting to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. I don't know if you keep up with it, but what a story for those young ladies that they've been able to experience. But God does. God, many times in our life, does the supernatural, and we're not even aware of it. Listen, remember what Nehemiah's occupation was? What was he? He was the cupbearer. He was the wine taster. And so, humanly speaking, Nehemiah wasn't, somebody else could go, but Nehemiah wasn't going to be able to make that trip. And God works on the king's heart, and he goes. And that being said, whatever you're facing, whatever miracle you need God to perform in your life this morning, know that He can do that. Okay, so the enemy has tried all kinds of tricks to keep the walls from going up. But the walls have been built. The enemy wasn't able to stop that. This morning, what I want us to look at, I want us to look at 4 strategies that Sanballat and Tobiah and the enemy uses against Nehemiah to try to discourage Nehemiah, to try to get him to leave and to quit. And he uses these same 4 strategies in our life personally. And I want to look at those this morning, and I want us to see how Nehemiah responded to them, which gives us a clue of how we need to respond to them. Satan's using on Nehemiah what he uses on us, but I think many times we don't respond the way Nehemiah does. And let's look at those strategies, and let's look at how Nehemiah responds to each one. Now, I'm going to go ahead and warn you as we get into chapter 6, there's going to be some of these names that I'm just going to guess at because I want to read them. So if you laugh, I'm going to call you up here to finish reading them, okay? Snicker under your breath. Don't laugh out loud. Some of these names, I don't know where they came from, but we'll read these verses this morning, and we get down to them. I'll do the very best I can. But if you'll follow along up here on the Bible, you'll realize how horrible I butcher them up. But let's look at the 4 strategies that Satan now tries to knock Nehemiah off course with. And when we get to the end of it, you'll realize Nehemiah stayed on course. He didn't get off. He didn't get discouraged. He didn't get rattled. He stood on the promises and the authority of God. So, number 1, the first strategy that the enemy uses here in chapter 6 is that of compromise. Probably as things are rolling through your mind now, as Christians, this is probably the one we fall prey to more than any other. Look at verses 1 through 4 in Nehemiah chapter 6. Let's see what the Bible says. Now it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left therein, though at that time I had not set the doors upon the gates. When the walls went up, Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let us meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they thought to do me mischief. So here, Nehemiah already sees what they're up to. This is not a meeting of how can we help make the wall stronger or help you finish. Verse 3. And I, Nehemiah, sent messengers unto them, saying, I am doing a great work, so that I cannot come down. Why should the work cease while I leave it and come down to you? Yet they sent me, how many more times? 4 times after this sort, and I answered them after the same manner. Here, Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem realize we can't beat him, so we'll do what? Join him. If you can't beat him, join him. That's the attack that the enemy is using now. They've done everything they could do to try to stop the walls from going up, but they're not going up. So now what they tell Nehemiah is, hey, let's have a meeting. Let's meet in the valley of Ono and let's talk this thing through. We want to join sides with you now. Boy, how many times has the enemy come to us dressed as an angel of light? How many times has he come telling us that he wants to join sides with us? But listen, Nehemiah tells us in verse 2, they thought to do me mischief. Do you know, I think one of the keys to not compromising in our walk with God is to do what Nehemiah does, and that's spend time on your knees before God. Otherwise, he's going to trip you up, and otherwise, you're going to compromise. And I wonder how many times we have fallen prey to compromising our morals or otherwise, because the enemy has come dressed as an angel of light and we don't recognize him. I think there's 2 things that stand out here that tell us why Nehemiah didn't give in to compromise. Number 1, he saw it coming. He saw it for what it was. He'd already dealt with these cats. He knew that they had not had some kind of revival experience all of a sudden. He knew it. And here's the second thing. And I think if we do this one, it keeps us out of troubles and it keeps us out of church squabbles and church splits and anything else. It says in verse 3, Nehemiah says this, I sent a messenger saying, I am doing what? A great work. In other words, Nehemiah is doing what God's called him to do. Do you know that if every member, every saved member of every church would do the work God's called us to do, there'd never be a church split. You never would deal with garbage that destroys churches and families and lives. But we compromise because we're not doing what God's put us here to do. Not just inside the 4 walls of the church, but outside it, at work, at school, on the athletic field. When I'm with nobody else, when I'm by myself, am I going to do the right thing? That's what it's about. That's how you stop compromising in your life, is know that it's coming, stay geared up in prayer, and do the work God's called you to do. Be the person, be the Nehemiah, be the Esther, be the Ruth, be the Paul that God has called you to be. When we do that, we don't compromise. When we don't do that, we compromise. And we give in to those things that we otherwise say, I would never have done that. But we do it. Listen to this illustration. Years ago, there was a missionary in China whose abilities were so outstanding that one of the American companies tried to hire him. They offered him an attractive job with a salary just as attractive, but he turned it down. He told them that God had sent him to China as a missionary. He thought that would end the matter. But instead, they came back with a better offer and an increase in salary. He turned that down too. But again, they came back, doubling the financial package. Finally, here's what he said to them. It's not your salary that's too little. It's your job that's too small. When you let that sink in spiritually, you get what he's saying. God's called me to a great work. And that great work is to be a missionary in China. That work is greater than any job you could offer me. Because this is of God. This is what God's called me to do. I wonder this morning if we could all stand up and with 100% certainty say, I am doing what God's called me to do. You see this in the realm of athletics more than anywhere, and I guess I'd use illustrations about that because I taught and coached for 10 years. But you watch a team that wins any championship, soccer, football, basketball, baseball, you name it. When negotiations are being made for salaries for the next year, do you know that some of those athletes jump ship and go to a team that's not nearly as good with zero potential of winning the championship because they get more money? They can't live off of $5 million. They've got to have more than that. And it becomes a compromise. It becomes a greed issue. They don't care about winning. They care about padding the pocketbook. Most of them, not all of them. And they compromise. They give up a championship caliber team to a less than mediocre team, but a more padded pocketbook is what they do. And this guy's saying, I'm doing a great work because this is what God's called me to do. The money's not worth it. Your job's not worth it. I'm right where God wants me to be. And he didn't compromise that. So the first thing is, he came to Nehemiah with compromise. He didn't bite. Here's the second thing they tried, slander. Look at verses 5 through 7. In verse 5 it says, Then sent Sanballat his servant unto me in like manner the fifth time, with an open letter in his hand. Now, let me tell you what this was. This open letter meant anybody could read it. You could read it, you could share it with anybody. That's what it was. It was an open letter. And here's what it was. Here's what was in the letter. Wherein was written, It is reported among the heathen in Geshem, saith it, that thou and the Jews think to rebel, for which cause thou buildest the wall, that you may be their king, according to these words. In other words, here's what the letter says. Nehemiah, you're trying to take over the Persian king. You're trying to be top dog, and you're going to build an army to overthrow the king. Now, it wasn't true, but that's what was in the letter, that they were wanting to get out into the hands of the people so that they could begin to do what we've all been guilty of doing, and that's gossip. Spread something that wasn't true, but spread it to try to destroy Nehemiah. Someone once said this about gossip. I think I got it up here for you. I think. I may not have it. They give it to you? There it is. There it is. Gossip is news you have to hurry to tell somebody else before you find out it isn't true. That's what gossip is. And that's what they were doing to Nehemiah. That's why it was an open letter. They wanted people to have access to it, to be able to read it, to be able to spread it and share it. And you had to know it went out like wildfire. But basically, again, it's saying, you're not up to any good, Nehemiah. You're trying to take over the king of Persia, Artaxerxes. You're trying to take over his throne. And you're coming up with an army to do that. Notice how Nehemiah responds to this slander. Verses 8 and 9. Then I sent unto him, saying, there are no such things done as you are saying, but thou feignest them out of thine own heart. For they all made us afraid, saying, their hands shall be weakened from the work, that it be not done. Now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Here's how Nehemiah responds, and again, it's a great lesson to learn. We ought to respond like Nehemiah. Here's the first thing Nehemiah did. First thing he did was he said, that's not true. Now, he didn't go about defending himself. He just simply said, that's a false statement. What you are sharing is not true. That's not what I'm doing. The second thing he does is he puts the matter in God's hands. God, you've brought me from Susha to here. You've protected me. You've provided me with everything I've needed. You've protected me from the enemy outside. We've resolved conflicts on the inside. I think you can handle these cats. And the third thing he did was he kept working. He didn't stop. So many times when the enemy brings slander against us, which he's really trying to slander God, not us. We're the tool he tries to use. You know what we do? We quit working and we try to defend ourselves. What we need to do is say, you know what, God, that's really not true. But I get you take it and you deal with it however you want to deal with it, but I'm going to keep working. I'm going to keep doing, I'm going to keep teaching that Sunday school class. I'm going to keep working with children's church. I'm going to keep helping Team Kid. I'm going to keep doing what you've called me to do. And I'm going to trust you to take care of what's going on. Nehemiah had the job of taking care of his character, which he did, and he let God worry about his reputation. And God did a pretty good job of defending Nehemiah. But that's how Nehemiah handled the slander that came his way. He just simply said, guys, that's not true. Now I'm fixing to sick God on you. And while God's dealing with you, I'm going to keep working. And that's what God's asking us to do. So it's compromise and slander. Here's the third tool that he uses. The tool called threat. Look at verses 10 through 14 in Nehemiah chapter. Here come some of these names now. Afterward I came unto the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Menedabil, who was shut up. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let us shut the doors of the temple, for they will come to slay thee. Yes, in the night will they come to slay thee. And I said, should such a man as I flee? Nehemiah saying, what do you mean, run? And who is there that being as I am would go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. It was forbidden for Nehemiah to go into the temple beyond the altar of burnt offerings. Remember, there was a king by the name of Uzziah who tried that, and he was struck with leprosy. Nehemiah knew he couldn't do that. In verse 12, and lo, I perceived that God had not sent him. Here it is again. How did Nehemiah know that? Because Nehemiah was in communion with God. He spent his life talking with God. But that he pronounced this prophecy against me, for Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. Again, they're up to no good. Verse 13, therefore was he hired that I should be afraid and do so in sin, and that they might have matter for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, think thou upon Tobiah and Sanballat according to these their works, and on the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets that would have put me in fear. In verse 3, you don't have to flip back and look at it, but in verse 3 that we read just a moment ago, Nehemiah says, I cannot come down. And in verse 11 he says, I will not go in. Nehemiah is being threatened that the enemy is coming. You got to go hide in the temple. And Nehemiah said, I'm not going to run. I'm not running. God has gone to bat for me on more than one occasion, and God will do it here. And in verse 14, it's another one of Nehemiah's short, brief prayers, like when Peter was sinking on the water, Lord save me. This is another one of Nehemiah's short prayers. Just like he did when the king asked him what he wanted. And Nehemiah makes a short prayer, then lays out his request. He does the same thing here. But guys, the short prayers that we offer in life to God come from a long prayer life. And that's what Nehemiah exemplifies here. The threats come against him, and Nehemiah does what we need to do. He hands it to God. He doesn't run. How many times do we run when Satan comes after us? Not only do we run, we do like Jonah. We run further away from God instead of to Him. And Nehemiah said, I'm not running. I'm not going into the temple. I'm not running. God's going to take care of me. Because I see it as a threat from the enemy that's coming to supposedly do me harm, which they weren't. And that's the way we ought to handle the threats. And then number 4 is what I call intrigue. A secret plot against Nehemiah. Look at verses 15 through 19. And this again is some of the inside work. So the walls were finished in the 25th day of the month Elul, in the 52 days. And it came to pass that when all our enemies heard thereof, and all the heathen that were about us saw these things, they were much cast down in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was wrought of God. Now listen to these next verses. Moreover, in those days the nobles of Judah sent many letters unto Tobiah, and the letters of Tobiah came unto them. For there were many in Judah sworn unto him, sworn unto Tobiah. Why? Because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Ara, and his son Johanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Berechiah. And they reported his good deeds before me and uttered my words to him, and Tobiah sent letters to put me in fear. See, Tobiah was tied to the tribe of Judah through marriage. And what they were doing, they were spilling the beans to Tobiah about everything that Nehemiah was doing. And so the enemy is trying to come up with one tactic after another to draw up and pull up dirt on Nehemiah to get the people to turn against him. So that they would look at Nehemiah. They were trying to cast just enough doubt on Nehemiah's character and reputation that the people would turn on him. And none of it worked. Listen to what A.W. Tozer says. Andrew Boner. Andrew Boner says this. Let us be as watchful after the victory as before the battle. You know why he says that? Because so many times when we have a victory in our life, as Nehemiah them did in building the walls in 52 days, right after victory we sit down and we stop. You know, and going back to the basketball illustration, Mississippi State knocking off a team called UConn who had won 111 straight games. The thing they have to guard on tonight when they play is nothing they did the other night will score any points tonight. Every victory we win in the Christian life, we can look at it and learn from it, but none of that helps in the next victory. And I think that's what Andrew is saying here. Be watchful after the victory. just as you were before the battle. Stay on guard is what he's saying. Stay prayed up. Do the work. And if we'll do those things, God will see us through it. And it doesn't matter how sneaky the devil tries to be. When our minds and eyes and hearts and ears are focused on what they need to be focused on, and guys, that's this. That's the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that He did it for me. And that He's with me every day. When I focus on that, everything else takes place. Let me read these to you, and then I want to close with a story. You don't have to write these down, but if you want them later, I'll give them to you. The story begins with the story of Nehemiah. So I prayed, chapter 2 and verse 4. Then, so I came to Jerusalem, chapter 2, verse 11. Then, so they strengthened their hands for their good work, chapter 2, verse 18. Then, so built we the wall, chapter 4, verse 6. Then, so we labored, chapter 4, verse 21. And then, to end this part of the story, so the wall was finished, chapter 6, verse 15. There's a story about a Native American who left the reservation to join his cousin who lived in the city. One day, as they were walking down a busy street, the Native American said, "I hear a cricket." His city cousin was amazed because all he could hear was the traffic. After a short search, the man reached down and picked up the cricket. When he stood up, he pulled some change out of his pocket and dropped it on the sidewalk. The noise was no louder than the crickets. But immediately, several pedestrians stopped and turned toward the sound. The man then turned to his cousin and said, "See, people hear what's important to them." We hear what's important to us. Maybe we don't hear God speaking a lot of times because that's not important to us. Do you know why Nehemiah could see the enemy coming? He knew all the plans, he knew all the tricks. Because Nehemiah knew what was important to him. And what was important to Nehemiah wasn't necessarily building the walls and keeping Jerusalem safe. What was important to Nehemiah was obeying God. And doing what God called him to do. And guys, that's what should be important to us. So the enemy's coming with these four things. If I could remember them, I'd give them to you again, but I can't. He comes with those things. Let's be like Nehemiah and be on guard for him. He'll come today. He'll come this week. Be on guard for him. He's coming. But we can respond like Nehemiah. Father, thank you for this message. And thank you that, Lord, if we know the enemy's coming, we're better prepared. And Lord, he is coming. He's coming against us as individuals, as families. He's coming against Victory Hill Baptist Church. And Lord, we need to stand guard and be ready and stay prayed up. And we need to intercede for our brothers and sisters who are still straddling the fence, spiritually speaking. And Lord, help us to fall on your side and do what you've called us to do. Thank you that Nehemiah was that man of prayer, that man who walked with you. He didn't give in to the intrigue and to the threats and to the compromise and to the slander. He didn't give in to any of that stuff because he walked with you. Lord, I pray for those this morning who may not even know you. I pray that they would come, not join this church, but come find Jesus. For Christians who need to come and pray and renew their commitment to you, give them strength to do that. But you take this time of invitation and you use it to bring glory and honor to you in Jesus' name.